this lecture on Plato's theory of politics in the Republic, we'll be looking at one of the foremost philosophers of all time. He was born in 428 BC, which means that he lived 2,400 years ago. He was inspired by another great philosopher, his teacher, Socrates. He founded the Academy at age 40 in order to set forth his ideas, and during that time he wrote The Republic, his most famous work and the major announcement of his entire political philosophy. It was Alfred North Whitehead, a professor of philosophy at Harvard, who perhaps with some exaggeration said that Plato's philosophy is so encyclopedic that the whole of Western philosophy can be seen as merely a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, Plato's purpose in writing the Republic was to bring philosophy to politics, to uplift politics, to inject into politics vision and character. And as he set forth these ideas, he manages to expound some of the truly great concepts of Western tradition. And those ideas were of justice and of goodness and beauty and truth, but perhaps above all of power. And as we treat Plato and then Aristotle and then after that Hobbes and Locke, we'll be focusing increasingly on the idea of power, because this is, of course, at the center of political philosophy. The Republic begins with the question, what is justice? And slides into more and more consideration of power. It's done in the form of a dialogue between Socrates and a number of his friends and adversaries. And there are three main responses in the first part of the Republic to this key question, what is justice? The first response is given by one of Socrates' young friends, Polemarchus. And Polemarchus addresses the question, asks, what is justice? And says, well, justice is no more than helping one's friends and harming one's enemies. That is, it's no more than an eye for an eye, or tooth for a tooth, as said in another biblical context. Socrates argues against this, and very significantly for the first time in political thought, announces that justice, or as he defines justice, right conduct, cannot mean ever to inflict harm on another person. And so he disagrees with Polemarchus's definition, sweeping it aside and saying that justice or right conduct must always mean to elicit the very best from an individual, to treat that individual in a way that that individual is uplifted or humanized as a result of that interaction. He introduces an important concept, which I've noted in our glossary, of arete. Arete means the virtue or excellence or gift that any individual has, and each of us has this particular quality. Just behavior, right conduct, must mean always then trying to bring out one's arete, or one's particular gift, one's excellence. Socrates says that can never be done through punishing an individual or harming an individual. And thus, Polemarchus's definition of justice, while it might be necessary at times to harm people in self-defense, it cannot be seen as right conduct or just conduct in all ways. Right conduct or just conduct, Socrates says at the end of this crucial first exchange with Polemarchus, does not mean an eye for an eye. It means dealing with others in a humane manner. The next discussion and discussant is between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is entirely different from Polemarchus. Polemarchus was a young, eager student, but Thrasymachus is a cynic, a person that we refer to in Greek philosophy as a sophist, who believes that all values are necessarily relative. And the exchange between Socrates and Thrasymachus, I think, is one of a person, a philosopher like Socrates, who is defending ideal values against Thrasymachus, the relevist, who is saying that justice can mean no more than might, and might is always right. So from Thrasymachus' point of view, and this is an important point again made in political philosophy, and as we look back on the tradition of political thought, we wonder how Plato could have introduced in this text so many critical questions all around this discussion of what is justice. What is justice, then? Thrasymachus says, justice is no more than what is in the interest of the strongest party. So that person or that party or that political group who happens to have charge of a situation will define justice, and whatever that party says is justice will be just. A cynical definition of justice, then, that Thucydides discusses in his History of the Peloponnesian War and deplores it. It's a definition that had characterized Athenian thinking during the Peloponnesian War, during the debasement of values, the cynicism into which the Athenians lapsed during that war. Socrates says, Thrasymachus, this cannot be justice. It can't be right conduct to interact in this way, that is, to insist that might is always right, that the stronger must always prevail. Just behavior means something more than that. And at this point, Socrates makes an analogy which is critical for the Republic and something which we must reflect on. And the analogy, the first of a series of analogies that he'll make, is between the politician and the physician, or the political leader and the doctor. The politician, Socrates says, must be held to certain standards, just as the physician is held to certain standards. What we want in politics is true professionalism of the kind that we have in medicine. We want a kind of Hippocratic oath, then, for politics. Remember that Hippocrates was living during the time of Socrates and must have influenced Plato's writing in this respect. So when Plato says to Thrasymachus that we want the analogy of a physician to a politician to prevail, he means that politicians should act more like the professionals that we have in medicine. And how do they act? Well, presumably a good physician never sees his patient as the weaker patient on which he is to inflict his will. That is, the physician sees his client or his patient as one to be regarded with humanity, to be considered with genuine interest. And therefore, if doctors, good doctors, were the models and to set the standards for politicians, we'd have in politics a much more humane practice. We'd have a professional practice. We'd be able to hold people to higher standards. That's what we need in politics. What is just behavior, then? What is justice, according to Socrates? Justice is a kind of human relationship that it's characterized by what ideally we find in the relationship between the good doctor and the patient. That is a relationship that's notable for its humanity, for its concern. And Socrates will say that justice must, first of all, be concerned with the Hippocratic maxim, first do no harm. If only in politics we could have that maxim, first do no harm. Now, after the exchange between Socrates and Thrasymachus, the third part of the exchange is between Socrates and, again, a young student of his by the name of Glaucon. Glaucon happens to be an older brother of Plato. And Glaucon tries to revive Thrasymachus's argument. He tries to set forth the idea that justice is, after all, relative, but he wants to expand Thrasymachus's argument in a way to apply it not just might is right, but to say that in human nature there is a quality of selfishness that makes all our interests necessarily allied to our selfish behavior. And he asks then of Socrates, how did justice originate, Socrates? And Socrates says, well, Glaucon, you tell us how it originated. And Glaucon said, well, clearly it originated because in the state of nature, in our original human condition, people were, Glaucon says, all concerned with protecting one another. and protecting themselves. That is, there was a state of mutual security and insecurity when people were afraid and they needed protection, protection of their families and protection of their own selves, their self-interests. And in that state of a need for protection, law was created. People then grouped together and suggested, let's write a contract. And this contract or covenant would set forth these ideas, that law or justice meant only mutual protection, that the weak would be protected against the strong. And if the strong had to observe these rules, then that's what is necessary. Glaucon says, to reinforce this critical argument, he says, let's consider, Socrates, a myth, the myth of Gyges. And the myth of Gyges, from Glaucon's point of view, is this. He gets it from the Greek historian Herodotus, and he embellishes it a great deal. It tells the story of a poor shepherd who was wandering one day in the fields and comes upon a chasm. He goes down into the chasm and discovers in the chasm a skeleton, a huge skeleton, and the skeleton has a ring. And the ring glowing there attracts Gyges so much, this shepherd, that he goes and he takes the ring off the finger of the skeleton. And he puts it on. He doesn't know quite what this ring means. But as he begins to circulate among other shepherds, he notices that when he turns the ring a certain way, his friends will say, "Where's Gyges? What's happened to Gyges?" And he understands soon that the ring, turning it in a way, makes him invisible. Now Glaucon asks Socrates, imagine if we had this power to become invisible, Socrates. What do you think we would do? And Socrates says, well, I don't know. And Glaucon says, well, I'll tell you what Gyges did according to this myth. Did he found a philanthropic organization? Did he create a great deal of money and give it away to charity or something of that sort? No, quite the opposite. With his invisibility, he managed to maximize his own interest to the extent of getting into the castle, murdering the king, seducing the queen, and seizing the throne. From Glaucon's point of view, the lesson of this myth of Gyges is that we all, if we could have the power of being invisible, would do precisely this. We would all become like Gyges, selfish and greedy, but above all, lusting for power. And that seizure of power, that will to dominate, that desire to prevail, that's in all of us. What is justice then? Justice is no more than a contract that keeps people under control, that offers protection from Gyges and that kind of behavior. Justice is then an agreement that people make so that if there are others who become more powerful, then these people will have to abide by the interests of all. Justice is law, but law is contrived. There's nothing transcendental in it. There's nothing particularly moral. There is only this, protection against those who may be stronger. Now that's the conclusion of Glaucon, and Socrates responds to it. And Socrates' response takes us into the rest of the argument of the Republic. Socrates argues that we can't all be seen as Gyges. Is there a Gyges gene, a dominant gene in all of us that is selfish and greedy and lustful? He says to Glaucon, this is the worst way of viewing humanity. We must try to elicit the best from people and not look to their worst. We must try to define a common interest, not just a selfish interest, and that common interest is that justice should prevail, that the good state certainly will emerge. How will this good state emerge, though, from Socrates' point of view? Well, he says there must be, and he's speaking now to Glaucon and Thrasymachus and Polemarchus and Plato and others who are there must be three reforms or waves of change. He calls these three tidal waves of transformation that must sweep over the corrupt polis, transform it into something new and better and right and true. And these three waves of change, according to Socrates are, first of all, to make women and men equal in terms of their qualifications for rule. Now, this is critical, important, because at this time, women were regarded, as we'll see when we talk about Aristotle, as those who must perform no public duties, have no property, whose responsibilities were confined entirely to the home, therefore had no public office of any kind. And to suggest that women and men might be equal, to become even equal leaders of a polis, was revolutionary. Why does Plato want to do this? Well, as Woody Allen once said about the advantages of bisexuality, he said we can immediately double the number of potential partners that we could get on a Saturday night for a date. Plato is certainly looking to the female population here as people that he can recruit, individuals that he can use. Women shouldn't be excluded as they had been from rule, and therefore will include them. But only, this is Plato's emphasis, those women who are truly qualified, just as men must be truly qualified. That is, women who are intelligent, who can pass the tests, the kind of medical boards, if we were to set them up for politics, who can become then part of this intellectual elite that Plato is suggesting. Now, that's the first wave of reform that must sweep through the polis. The second is to create an extended family of rulers that Plato calls the guardians. This elite of intellectuals chosen by the same rigorous standard that we choose our physicians, this elite of intellectuals will rule the polis. There'll be a minority within the community. And in this extended family, two major reforms will be undertaken. First is that these guardians will not own property, and that deprivation of private property is key, because from Plato's point of view, to abolish property is necessary. The abolition of property means the abolition of greed and lust and possessiveness and all the rest among his leaders. And then after that, the nuclear family itself will be abolished. So this will be truly an extended family with property in common and spouses in common and children in common. Extended to an extent then that these guardians, these rulers, will not be tempted by nepotism or by possessiveness. They'll be truly ideal in the sense that they will be free of that problem or those many problems that characterized rulers during that period. That critical reform, then, that transforms the rulers into those who are thinking not of their own private families or property, but of the state and the needs of the state, was the second wave, tidal wave, of transformation that sweeps over the old corrupt polis. And the last of the three waves is to put these guardians in positions of absolute political power with no checks or balances. That is, these are the people that will administrate the state. From these people, the guardians, the vision will emerge. From these few, then, the rule will be just and rational. The confidence, then, is that individuals who are free from concerns about family and property will be able to shape policy. In this polis, then, truly, reason will rule. Well, Plato argues his position further through the use of two parables or allegories that we'll want to look at now in order to reinforce his point about the just state looking just in this way. That is, that it is ruled by a group of intellectuals, an elite gifted because of their vision, because of their education, and because of having been liberated, as we've seen, from concerns, narrow, partial, selfish concerns of family and property. Men and women, a truly revolutionary proposal. The two parables that he tries to persuade us with to reinforce his argument are the parable first of the ship of state, and then second, the allegory of the cave or the parable of the cave. And so let's analyze these two and then conclude with their points. The first, the parable of the ship of state. He says, imagine this state of affairs where you're going for a voyage and you get on the ship and you find that the master of the ship, the captain, is not only short-sighted and deaf, but stupid, ignorant, unknowing about anything relating to running a ship, seamanship. Second, because the master is so ignorant, the crew finds it very easy to manipulate him, to appeal to him, to flatter him, and therefore to run the ship themselves, except the crew happens to be totally unqualified too. They're only concerned with the maximization of their pleasure on the voyage, and so they turn it into what Plato calls a drunken carousal. The third party on the ship, the navigator that you look to, is unfortunately viewed with contempt. The passengers then are destined for a terrible voyage, and only shipwreck can be the conclusion. And Plato says this parable is directly analogous to a democratic state, the democratic state that he knew in Athens. It's that democratic state in which the master, in fact the sovereign people in this case, they're ignorant, they're short-sighted, they're deaf. The crew represents the demagogic politicians in Athens, the people who seduced the master, who managed to persuade the master that they were right and that they should prevail. And during the Peloponnesian War, these politicians, from Plato's point of view, were awful. Not only did they lose the war, because Athens lost the war against Sparta in 404 BC, Athens was not just the loser, it was overrun and humiliated. It meant the end of this great Athenian civilization as we look back on it. How could this have happened? Because it was run by a democratic government, and Plato despises democracy. Plato says then that we want a state run not by this ignorant master, this captain who is short-sighted and deaf, not by a crew who is only concerned, these politicians, with their own cheap, narrow, partial interests. We want a ship truly run by the navigator, who is not dealt with contempt, but rather seen in an honorable sense as the person who has the most knowledge. That's the way a state should be run, by the person who has knowledge. The navigator is the one individual who possesses a sense of seamanship, who has knowledge of astronomy, who is a scientist, just as the physician is a scientist. And that navigator should be analogous to the philosopher ruler, the person who is in charge because he or she has a command of the scientific principles of how to run a state, i.e. political science. That's the first parable. The second one is the parable of the cave, or usually referred to as the allegory of the cave. And Plato now asks us, with this extraordinarily vivid imagination that he has, to imagine entering an underground cavern in which we find darkness and illusion, because it is so much without light or enlightenment. And the people in this underground cavern, as they look around, can see only illusion and not reality. They have hardly any sense of what they're looking at. They look at the walls of the cave and they see the shadows on the walls of the cave, and they imagine that that's reality. As Plato points out, this is ignorance, profound ignorance, and yet these people that inhabit the cave are unaware of it. Now he says further, what would happen if a person were able to turn around and look towards the entrance of the cave, see light down that long tunnel, follow the tunnel out into the open, understand for the first time through the sunlight, through the light out there, that the reality that is outside the cave is true reality. What was mistaken as reality inside the cave is only illusion. What if that person who got out came back and told these people, look, you've been looking only at the shadows and the walls of the cave and not reality? What would they do? Plato says, alluding to the fate of Socrates, who was killed by a democratic state, that is, he was sentenced to death and forced to take hemlock in 399 BC. Plato's teacher, the most righteous man in Athens, Plato alludes to Socrates by saying, they would kill this man just as they killed Socrates. So the person with the truth, the person who has seen the light, the person who has a knowledge of ultimate reality, he comes back into the cave and he's murdered. What kind of state would it need in order to put people like Socrates in power? Well, Plato says that the sort of state that we must have would have to educate the population in a way that when that person came back, having been out of the cave, he or she would be welcomed as a ruler and not as a wild-eyed lunatic. People must be educated then, not that they, the whole majority, can get out of the cave, but at least to receive that person when that person comes back with an understanding that that person has been truly enlightened. We want those individuals to rule. And at the very end of the allegory, Plato says in his Republic, one of the finest parts of the Republic, we don't want, he says, an unjust polity any longer, in which men live fighting one another about shadows and quarreling for power as if that were some great prize. The kind of just polis that we need will have rulers unlike any ruler of the present day, because our rulers will think of holding power only as an unavoidable necessity and have no lust for it. For the truth is that you can have a well-governed society only if you can discover for your future rulers a better way of life than being in office. Then only will power be in the hands of men who are rich, not in gold, but in the wealth that brings happiness, a good and wise life. All goes wrong when starved for lack of anything good in their own lives. Men turn to public affairs, hoping to snatch from thence the happiness they hunger for. They set about fighting for power, and this internecine conflict ruins them and their country. The life of true philosophy is the only one that looks down upon offices of state, and access to power must be confined to men who are not in love with it. So whom else can you compel to undertake the guardianship of the Commonwealth, if not those who, besides understanding best the principles of government, enjoy a nobler life than the politicians today and look for rewards of a different kind? And notice the points that he makes in this critical paragraph at the end of the allegory of the cave. First of all, it's the view of power that is all important. One must not lust for power. One must receive power as an obligation, as a responsibility to the whole state, to use it because there is a common interest and not a selfish interest involved. It's the question of power here that is at the fore. Plato believes now in a concentration of power among these few, this elite on top, it's true. But this elite will look at power in a different way. That is, they will look at it in a disinterested way. They'll see power as a responsibility and not as an object to be acquired. When Plato says that the problem today is that people are starved for lack of anything good in their own lives, and then they go into politics, he's making a critical point, and that is the political leaders that we want must be individuals who have integrity and character, who have discovered their arete as being that of political leadership, and enter politics precisely because they understand that this is a noble profession comparable to the profession of medicine. When we look to Plato, then, we look to a philosopher of power, and he is to be acclaimed as the first political philosopher who sets forth power as a noble enterprise.